Hello everyone, welcome to the Mysterious Stories channel, where you'll discover the most mysterious, scary, and fascinating stories. Make sure to turn up the volume and get ready for a spine-chilling experience you won't forget. The year was 1968, one of the most intense periods of the Vietnam War. The American military unit known as Charlie Coyote received orders to penetrate deep into the jungles of Vietnam, tasked with locating and destroying a rumored Viet Cong base hidden in the thick, oppressive wilderness. As they trudged deeper into the jungle, the men of Charlie Coyote were enveloped by a suffocating darkness. The towering trees seemed to close in around them, their branches clawing at the soldiers as they passed. The air was thick with humidity, making every breath feel like a struggle. The jungle was alive with the sounds of insects and distant animal calls, but beneath it all was an eerie silence, as if the jungle itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Private Mikey Thompson, a young soldier from Alabama, couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. His heart pounded in his chest, not just from the exertion of the march, but from a deep-seated fear that gnawed at him. He glanced around at his comrades, seeing the same unease reflected in their eyes. They were all veterans, hardened by months of combat, but there was something about this place that unnerved them all. "Keep your eyes sharp, boys," Sergeant James Sarge Williams barked, his voice rough from years of barking orders. "This jungle ain't our friend, and neither is whatever's out there." As the sun dipped below the horizon, the jungle was swallowed by a blackness so complete it felt as though the world had ceased to exist. The soldiers set up camp, their flashlights casting long, flickering shadows that seemed to dance and shift in the darkness. The oppressive silence of the jungle was broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of an unseen creature. That night, as the men of Charlie Coyote huddled around a small, flickering fire, the first signs of the jungle's malevolence began to manifest. Strange whispers drifted through the camp, carried on the wind, voices speaking in a language none of them could understand. The soldiers exchanged uneasy glances, their hands instinctively gripping their rifles tighter. "What the hell is that?" Private Anderson muttered, his voice trembling. "Just the wind, Anderson," Sarge replied, though even he sounded uncertain. "Get some sleep. We've got a long day ahead of us." But sleep didn't come easy for any of them. Every time one of the soldiers closed their eyes, they were haunted by visions of shadowy figures moving through the jungle, their eyes glowing like embers in the night. When morning finally came, the men were pale and exhausted, but they pushed on, driven by the need to complete their mission. By the third day, the tension had grown unbearable. The jungle seemed to be toying with them, leading them in circles, always just out of reach of their objective. The men were on edge, jumping at every sound, every movement in the underbrush. They were all experienced soldiers, but this was unlike any battle they had faced before. The enemy here wasn't just the Viet Cong, it was the jungle itself, a living, breathing entity that wanted them gone. As the sun began to set once more, casting long shadows through the dense foliage, Mikey noticed something unusual. A flash of white among the trees, just at the edge of his vision. He turned his head, squinting into the gloom, but saw nothing. Just as he was about to dismiss it as his imagination, he heard it a low, mournful wail that seemed to rise from the depths of the earth itself. "Did you hear that?" Mikey whispered, his voice barely audible. "What?" Private Harris asked, looking around nervously. That sound," Mikey replied, his voice shaking. Before Harris could respond, the wail came again, louder this time, echoing through the trees. It was a sound that seemed to pierce their very souls, filling them with a primal fear that they couldn't explain. "Form up," Sarge ordered, his voice cutting through the growing panic. The men quickly fell into formation, their rifles at the ready, eyes scanning the jungle for any sign of movement. But the only thing they saw was the darkness, pressing in on them from all sides. Then, without warning, something burst from the trees, a figure, clad in tattered, blood-stained rags, its face hidden beneath a filthy cloth. The soldiers opened fire, their bullets ripping through the air, but the figure didn't fall. It moved with an unnatural speed, darting between the trees, its mournful wail rising to a deafening pitch. "Fall back! Fall back!" Sarge shouted, his voice barely audible over the cacophony of gunfire and the figure's wails. The soldiers retreated, their hearts pounding in their chests, but the figure pursued them, its cries echoing in their ears. Just as it seemed they would be overtaken, the figure suddenly vanished, leaving the soldiers standing in the middle of the jungle, their rifles still trained on the empty air. "What the hell was that?" Anderson gasped, his face pale and his hands shaking. "I don't know," Sarge replied, his voice grim. "But I think we just found out what happened to the last unit that came through here." The next few days passed in a blur of fear and exhaustion. The soldiers pushed deeper into the jungle, but the encounters with the wailing figure became more frequent. Each time it appeared, it seemed to grow bolder, coming closer and closer before disappearing into the darkness. The soldiers began to crack under the strain, their nerves frayed to the breaking point. Mikey started having nightmares, visions of the figure standing over him, its face finally revealed. But instead of a face, there was only a gaping void, an endless darkness that seemed to pull him in, suffocating him. He would wake up in a cold sweat, his heart pounding, but the feeling of dread never left him. The jungle, too, seemed to be closing in on them. The trees loomed higher, their branches intertwining to form a canopy so thick that not even the midday sun could penetrate it. The air was heavy with the scent of decay, the ground beneath their feet soft and treacherous. They moved in a constant state of paranoia, jumping at every rustle of leaves, every shadow that flickered at the edge of their vision. One night, as they camped near a small, murky river, the fog rolled in. Thick and impenetrable, it swallowed the camp, turning their world into a maze of shadows and half-seen shapes. Mikey sat by the fire, staring into the flames, trying to banish the visions that plagued him. But the fog seemed to seep into his very soul, clouding his thoughts, filling him with a sense of overwhelming dread. "Can't sleep either." "Huh," Sarge said, sitting down beside him. His face was lined with exhaustion, his eyes bloodshot. "No, sir," Mikey replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "Something's wrong here, Sarge, this place. It's like it's alive, like it's feeding off our fear." Sarge nodded, staring into the flames. "I've seen a lot of things in this war, Mikey, but nothing like this. It's like the jungle's playing tricks on us, making us see things that ain't there. Or maybe they are there, and we're the ones who ain't real." Mikey didn't know how to respond to that, so he just sat in silence, listening to the sounds of the jungle. The fog seemed to amplify everything: the rustling of leaves, the distant calls of animals, the whispers of the wind. But beneath it all, there was another sound, one that made his blood run cold. It was the wail, faint at first, barely audible, but growing louder with each passing second. Mikey's heart raced as he scanned the fog, but he saw nothing. The wail grew louder, more insistent, until it was all he could hear. He covered his ears, trying to block it out, but it was no use. The sound filled his mind, drowning out everything else. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the wail stopped. The fog began to lift, and Mikey found himself sitting by the fire, alone. Sarge was gone. The camp was empty. "Sarge," Mikey called out, his voice trembling. "Sarge, where are you?" But there was no response. The only sound was the crackling of the fire and the distant rustle of leaves. Mikey stood up, his heart pounding, and began to search the camp. But it was as if everyone had simply vanished, leaving no trace behind. Panic set in as Mikey realized he was alone, truly alone, in the heart of the jungle. The oppressive silence pressed in on him, and he felt as though the jungle itself was watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. Mikey wandered through the jungle for what felt like hours, though he had no way of knowing for sure. Time seemed to lose all meaning in this place, where the sun never seemed to rise, and the night stretched on forever. The trees loomed over him, their branches twisting into grotesque shapes, their shadows reaching out like skeletal. The trees loomed over him, their branches twisting into grotesque shapes, their shadows reaching out like skeletal hands. Mikey's mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, each more terrifying than the last. Where were his comrades? What had happened to Sarge? He felt like he was losing his grip on reality, his sanity slipping away with every step he took deeper into the heart of the jungle. As Mikey pressed on, the terrain grew more treacherous. The ground became soft and swampy, sucking at his boots with every step. The air was thick with the stench of rot, and the sounds of the jungle had taken on a sinister tone. Low growls, rustling leaves, and the ever-present whispers that seemed to come from all around him. In his mind, he replayed the events of the past few days over and over, trying to make sense of what was happening. The wailing figure, the disappearing soldiers, the strange fog, it all felt like a nightmare from which he couldn't wake. But as much as he wanted to believe it was all in his head, the fear that gripped him was very real. Hours passed, or perhaps it was days. Mikey couldn't tell anymore. His senses were dulled by exhaustion and fear, his body running on autopilot as he trudged through the jungle. But then, through the haze of his fatigue, he noticed something up ahead, a faint glow, like the flicker of a distant flame. With renewed hope, Mikey quickened his pace, stumbling through the underbrush toward the light. As he drew closer, the glow became clearer, revealing itself to be a small campfire, surrounded by figures huddled around it. Relief flooded Mikey's heart as he recognized the faces of his comrades. There was Anderson, Harris, and even Sarge, all sitting around the fire, their expressions blank and distant. Mikey rushed forward, collapsing to his knees beside them. "Thank God, you're all here," he gasped, his voice trembling with emotion. "I thought I was the only one left." But the soldiers didn't respond. They sat in eerie silence, staring into the flames as if entranced by them. Mikey reached out to shake Anderson's shoulder, but the moment his hand touched him, Anderson's body slumped forward, collapsing into a lifeless heap. Mikey recoiled in horror, realizing that the others were the same, lifeless, their bodies cold and stiff. The fire continued to burn, casting a sickly light on the scene, but there was no warmth, no life in the camp. A chill ran down Mikey's spine as he backed away from the bodies, his mind racing. What was happening? Was this another trick of the jungle, or had something truly sinister claimed his comrades? As Mikey stumbled away from the camp, the wail returned, louder and more insistent than before. It seemed to come from all directions, surrounding him, filling his mind with a cacophony of voices that spoke in a language he couldn't understand. The ground beneath him began to tremble, and the trees twisted and writhed as if alive. Mikey fell to the ground, clutching his head in agony as the wailing reached a deafening crescendo. His vision blurred, and the world around him seemed to dissolve into a swirling vortex of darkness and sound. He felt himself being pulled down into the abyss, the weight of the jungle's malevolence pressing down on him from all sides. And then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The wail, the tremors, the darkness, they all vanished, leaving Mikey lying in the mud, gasping for breath. The jungle was still, the oppressive silence returning as if nothing had happened, but something had changed. Mikey could feel it in the air, in the way the trees seemed to loom over him, watching, waiting. He knew now that he was alone, truly alone in this cursed place. His comrades were gone, claimed by the jungle or by whatever dark force inhabited it. Mikey knew he couldn't stay in the jungle any longer. If he did, he would surely lose his mind, or worse. He had to find a way out, but the jungle seemed to stretch on forever, an endless maze of trees and shadows. Driven by desperation, Mikey pushed himself to his feet and began to run. He didn't know where he was going or how far he could make it, but he had to try. The jungle closed in around him, the trees forming an impenetrable wall on either side. But he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. As he ran, the whispers returned, growing louder with each step. They spoke in a language he didn't understand, but the tone was unmistakable, mocking, taunting, as if the jungle itself was laughing at him. The whale, too, began to rise again, but this time it was different, less mournful, more malevolent, as if whatever was behind it had finally revealed its true nature. Mikey's breath came in ragged gasps as he pushed himself to the limit. His legs burned with exhaustion, but he didn't dare slow down. The whale was right behind him now, closing in on him with every step. The ground beneath his feet was treacherous, filled with roots and rocks that threatened to trip him up at any moment. And then, up ahead, he saw a clearing in the trees, a patch of open sky. Hope surged through Mikey's heart as he realized he had found a way out. He pushed himself harder, running toward the light with everything he had. But just as he reached the edge of the clearing, the ground gave way beneath him. Mikey let out a cry of terror as he fell, tumbling down a steep slope into a dark, narrow ravine. He landed hard, the wind knocked out of him as he hit the rocky ground. For a moment, Mikey lay there, dazed and disoriented, but the wail was still there, growing louder, echoing off the walls of the ravine. He forced himself to his feet, but his ankle gave out beneath him, sending him crashing back to the ground. Pain shot through his leg as he realized he had twisted his ankle in the fall. He was trapped, unable to run, with the wailing creature closing in on him. Despair washed over him as he realized this was the end. There was no escape from the jungle, no escape from the horrors that haunted it. As the wail reached its peak, Mikey looked up, seeing the figure emerge from the shadows at the edge of the ravine. It was the same as before, clad in tattered rags, its face hidden beneath a filthy cloth, but now it seemed larger, more menacing. It moved with a slow, deliberate grace, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Mikey tried to crawl away, but his body refused to cooperate. The pain in his ankle was unbearable, and his strength was fading fast. The figure loomed over him, its presence suffocating, as it reached out with a skeletal hand. And then, in the darkness of the ravine, something strange happened. Mikey felt a surge of anger at the jungle, at the figure, at the war that had brought him to this cursed place. He wasn't going to die here. Not like this, not without a fight. With the last of his strength, Mikey reached for his rifle, which had miraculously stayed with him through the fall. He aimed it at the figure, his hands shaking, but his resolve unbroken. "Come on, you son of a bitch," Mikey growled through gritted teeth. "Let's see what you've got." The figure paused, as if taken aback by Mikey's defiance. For a moment, the wail faltered, the jungle falling into an eerie silence. Then, with a sudden, inhuman speed, the figure lunged at Mikey. Mikey fired, the gunshot echoing through the ravine like thunder. The bullet hit its mark, striking the figure square in the chest. But instead of falling, the figure let out a blood-curdling scream, its body convulsing as it dissolved into a cloud of black smoke. The smoke swirled around Mikey, choking him, filling his lungs with a foul, acrid stench. He struggled to breathe, his vision dimming, his strength fading. But just as he thought he was done for, the smoke began to dissipate, thinning out until it was gone. Mikey lay on the ground, gasping for air, his mind reeling from what had just happened. The figure was gone, the wail silenced. The jungle, too, seemed to have lost its malevolent presence, the oppressive weight lifting from Mikey's shoulders. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, there was peace. When Mikey finally managed to drag himself out of the ravine, the sun was beginning to rise, casting a pale light over the jungle. The once terrifying forest now seemed almost tranquil, the horrors of the night fading with the darkness. But Mikey knew better. The jungle might look peaceful now, but he had seen its true face. He had fought its monsters, faced its demons, and somehow, against all odds, survived. As he limped back toward the direction he thought would lead him out of the jungle, the weight of what he had just endured bore down on him. Every step was a struggle, his body screaming in pain, but he couldn't stop. He had to get out. He had to make it back to base, to tell anyone what had happened. The jungle, now bathed in the early morning light, seemed almost serene, but Mikey knew it was just a facade. The shadows still clung to the undergrowth, and the trees whispered in a language he could not understand. The memory of his fallen comrades weighed heavily on him, and guilt gnawed at his conscience. Had he abandoned them? Was it his fault they had perished in this cursed place? Mikey's mind raced as he tried to piece together what had happened. He thought of Sarge's last words, of the strange symbols he had seen etched into the trees, and of the wailing figure that had haunted them from the start. There was something ancient and evil in this jungle, something that had been awakened by the war, and it was not done with him yet. As Mikey pressed on, he began to hear voices faint at first, but growing louder with each passing moment. They were the voices of his comrades, calling out to him, pleading for help. He stopped in his tracks, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew it couldn't be real. He had seen their lifeless bodies. But the voices were so convincing, so full of pain and desperation, that he couldn't help but listen. Mikey, help us, don't leave us. He turned around, scanning the jungle, but there was no one there. The voices echoed all around him, coming from every direction. Panic set in as he realized that he was still trapped in the jungle's grip, that the horrors he had faced were far from over. Mikey clenched his fists, trying to block out the voices, but they only grew louder, more insistent. He could hear Anderson's laugh, Harris's quiet muttering, and Sarge's barked orders, all twisted into a nightmarish chorus that drilled into his skull. He stumbled forward, trying to outrun the voices, but they followed him, taunting him, accusing him of abandoning them. You left us to die. Mikey, you let them take us. No, Mikey screamed, clutching his head as he fell to his knees. I didn't. I tried to save you. I tried. The jungle seemed to close in on him, the trees bending and warping into grotesque shapes. The shadows stretched and twisted, forming into the ghostly figures of his fallen comrades, their faces contorted in pain and anger. They reached out to him, their hands cold and clammy as they gripped his arms, pulling him down into the earth. You can't leave. Mikey, you're one of us now. Mikey fought against them, thrashing and screaming, but their grip was too strong. The ground beneath him opened up, revealing a dark, bottomless pit, and the ghostly hands dragged him closer to the edge. He could feel the cold, suffocating darkness reaching up to claim him, to pull him down into the abyss where his comrades had been lost. In that moment, something snapped in Mikey's mind. The fear, the guilt, the grief, it all melted away, replaced by a burning rage. He wasn't going to let the jungle take him. He wasn't going to become one of its lost souls. With a primal roar, Mikey lashed out at the ghostly figures, his fists connecting with nothing but air. But his defiance was enough to break their hold, and he scrambled to his feet, backing away from the pit as the figures melted back into the shadows. The voices still whispered in his ears, but Mikey refused to listen. He knew now what he had to do. He had to leave this place, to return to the world of the living, no matter what it took. The jungle was a place of death, of madness, but he wasn't dead yet. And he wasn't going to let it take him without a fight. With renewed determination, Mikey turned and began to run. The jungle tried to slow him down, to trip him up with roots and branches, but he didn't stop. The voices faded into the background, replaced by the pounding of his heart and the sound of his own breath. He was close now. He could feel it, the edge of the jungle. The border between this nightmare and the world beyond was just ahead. And then, through the trees, he saw a break in the canopy, the first rays of sunlight piercing through the darkness. Mikey pushed himself harder, his legs burning with the effort, but he didn't care. He was almost there. He could almost taste the fresh air, feel the warmth of the sun on his skin. But just as he reached the edge of the jungle, something grabbed his ankle. Mikey cried out in pain as he was yanked back, his body hitting the ground with a thud. He twisted around, his eyes wide with terror, as he saw the wailing figure rising from the shadows, its skeletal hands wrapped around his leg. No, let me go, Mikey screamed, kicking out at the figure, but it held on tight, dragging him back into the jungle. Mikey fought with everything he had, but the figure was relentless, its grip unyielding. The light of the sun was just out of reach, but it might as well have been a million miles away. He could feel the darkness closing in around him, the jungle's malevolent presence pressing down on him, crushing him. And then, in a final act of desperation, Mikey reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, tarnished medallion, his mother's St. Christopher medal. He had carried it with him throughout the war, a symbol of protection, of hope. With a silent prayer, Mikey thrust the medal at the figure, pressing it against its bony hand. There was a blinding flash of light, and the figure let out an ear-piercing shriek, its grip on Mikey loosening. Mikey didn't hesitate. He kicked free and scrambled toward the light, his body moving on pure instinct. The figure recoiled, retreating into the shadows, its wail fading into the distance as Mikey broke through the last of the trees and into the open air. The sunlight hit him like a wave, warm and comforting, washing away the cold and the fear. Mikey collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath, his body trembling with exhaustion and relief. He had made it. He was out. He was alive. But, as he lay there, staring up at the clear blue sky, Mikey knew that the jungle had left its mark on him. He would never forget the horrors he had faced, the friends he had lost, the darkness that had almost consumed him. The war had taken a piece of his soul, and the jungle had taken another. And as Mikey finally got to his feet and began the long walk back to base, he knew that he would carry the scars of this nightmare with him for the rest of his life. The jungle might be behind him, but its shadows would haunt him forever. Weeks later, when Mikey finally made it back to base, he was a changed man. The once jovial soldier was now quiet and withdrawn, his eyes haunted by what he had seen. The other soldiers whispered about him, saying that he had gone mad in the jungle, that he had seen things no man should see. Mikey didn't care about the rumors. He didn't care about the pitying looks or the concerned questions. He had survived, but at what cost? The jungle had taken something from him that he would never get back. As the war dragged on, Mikey threw himself into his duties, trying to forget, trying to move on. But the memories of that night in the jungle never left him. They haunted his dreams, creeping into his thoughts when he least expected it. And no matter how hard he tried, he could never shake the feeling that the jungle was still out there, waiting for him, calling to him. In the end, Mikey knew that he had escaped the jungle, but he had never truly left it behind. The war might have ended, but for Mikey, the battle was far from over. If you enjoyed today's story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel, Mystical Tales, so you won't miss out on more eerie and thrilling tales in the future. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.